Biology students, we're going to finish chapter 8 now. We might get into chapter 9 a little bit. Next thing we're going to talk about is the origin of life on planet Earth as far as we know by looking at the rock record. And you should already know that life today is very diverse. We have animals, plants, protists, and funguses. And you should know that those belong to what domain? Domain Eukarya. So the kingdoms of domain Eukarya are Kingdom Animalia, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Protista, and Kingdom Fungi. We also have two other domains, domain Eubacteria, Eubacteria, the English is bacteria, and domain Archaea, which is the same in English as it is in Latin. You should know that the first fossils that we find are about 3.5 billion years old. And they are formed in what eon? What eon is this chapter about? The Archean. But some evidence, chemical evidence, indicates that organisms might have existed as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. BYA. They use GA, which is the same as BYA. Billions of years ago. So, as a scientist, you can't help wonder, how did life begin on planet Earth? And somehow we went from a world with no living organisms, and we had living organisms, and living organisms consist of cells. There are two main scientific theories regarding the origin of life. And I'll be honest with you right now, and I'll just tell you, I think there's the origin of life is not recorded in the rock record myself. But I have to go over the two main scientific theories regarding how life may have begun. The first comes from a man named Stanley Miller. Let's talk a little bit about Stanley Miller. Stanley Miller passed away in the 90s, but back in the 1950s, Dr. Miller, this is what he looked like when he was younger. He looked like this. Then this is what he looked like later on. Was wondering how might life have begun. And what he wanted to do is set up an experiment in the laboratory replicating the conditions that existed during Archean time, and to see if he could make life in the laboratory. And if he could replicate the conditions that existed during the Archean, and if he could produce living cells, then he could show that life began perhaps in the oceans, where most scientists think life must have begun. And so this is a photograph showing his actual experimental apparatus. Here he had a solution, and he tried to get the exact chemical composition of Archean seawater and put it into this glass tube, this glass container here. Then he tried to replicate the gases that existed in the Archean atmosphere, and he pumped those gases into the right combinations, so they replicated what would probably have existed as far as we knew in the 1950s about the Archean atmosphere. Then he had electrodes stuck into the top of this glass globe, and he applied an electrical charge, and he thought maybe this electrical charge would replicate the effects of lightning in the ancient oceans. He didn't really expect for anything to happen. He didn't expect to produce life in the test tube or in the laboratory. But to his great shock and amazement, the seawater turned a dark orange. And when he filtered out this seawater, he filtered out this seawater that was supposed to replicate Archean seawater. He was shocked and amazed to find that it consisted of amino acids. Did Stanley Miller produce life in the laboratory? No. En français, non. Ein Deutsch, nicht. He did not produce life in the laboratory, but what he did produce was amino acids. And amino acids are the building blocks of life. So Stanley Miller thought maybe in the ancient Archean oceans there was a lightning strike, and that caused the chemicals in the seawater to produce amino acids. And amino acids, as I mentioned before, are the building blocks of life. But they are not life. Life is proteins. And what are proteins? Proteins are chains of amino acids that have to be lined up just right to make a single protein. So Dr. Miller spent the rest of his life from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s trying to produce an actual living cell, proteins. Did Stanley Miller succeed? Again, no, he did not succeed. But with further laboratory experiments, he managed to produce something called proteinoids. And this is what they look like. These are these little microspheres. And they divided just like living cells. The problem is they are not living cells. They do not have DNA. They're not alive. They do not metabolize. They don't make their own food like plants. They don't consume food like animals. They're non-living, but they replicate. And what Stanley Miller wanted to eventually do was produce actual proteins in the laboratory, and then he could prove that that's how life began in the ancient Archean oceans. Honestly speaking, I don't think it's possible to produce life in the laboratory. And I'll tell you why. In order for that to happen, thousands of amino acids would have to line up. And that can't happen randomly. It will not happen randomly. If it happened randomly, then it would be happening again in the oceans. And we haven't seen it happen through hundreds of thousands of experiments and observations. We have not seen life be created by non-living chemicals. And if life was possible, could be formed from non-living chemicals, then how come no human being has ever been able to do it? I don't think it's possible to do it myself, honestly. But here you can see he did try, and he made these proteinoids, and he did make amino acids. So the first idea on how life might have begun is maybe the chemicals in the ocean reacted with the gases in the atmosphere. There was an electrical charge, amino acids formed, and then the amino acids lined up to make proteinoids, and eventually somehow proteinoids would react with amino acids or the water around it and form living cells. I think it's a hard sell myself. But the second idea as to how life may have originated or begun is through submarine hydrothermal vents. If you do a Google search on black smokers, you will see that refers to these chimney-like structures that spew dark black smoke on the bottom of the sea floor. In the 1970s, French submariners traveled miles deep underneath the ocean and photographed these black smokers. And they wondered, what in God's name are these things? What is this black smoke coming out of the sea floor? First thing they did was, besides taking photographs, is they put out temperature probes and found out that the water here coming out was 300 up to 300 degrees Celsius. That's about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That is really hot water coming out. And to their shock and amazement, when they sampled these black smokers, they found that there are these tiny little microscopic microbes belonging to domain Archaea. You might recall that there are 3 domains of life. Domain Eukarya, which breaks down into Kingdom Animalia, Kingdom Plantae, Kingdom Fungi, and Kingdom Protista. Then we had domain Eubacteria. English, we call them bacteria, such as those that made the stromatolites. And then the domain Archaea, we haven't talked about it. Archaea in Latin means ancient form of life. This is an ancient form of life. And these tiny little creatures live in this boiling hot water. No one had thought that that would be possible, that something could live in boiling hot water like that. Let's take a good close look and see what these creatures look like inside of these black smokers. They look like this. They're very primitive. They're microscopic. And then scientists did not think that anything could be living down here on the bottom of the ocean. Why? Miles deep underwater. There's no sunlight. Without sunlight, there could be no life, we thought. In order to have life, sunlight, something would have to photosynthesis. So, like cyanobacteria, they have to photosynthesize in order to manufacture their own food. We talked about photosynthesis. Let's talk about it again. Photosynthesis is what plants do, and eubacteria do. They take in CO2, they take in water, and they manufacture their own food called glucose. I can't do subscripts in here, but I think you get the idea. And they make oxygen. That's called photosynthesis. So plants and bacteria are what we call producers in the biological world. They produce their own food. This is their food, glucose, sugar. Animals do the opposite of plants. If you think about it, animals do the opposite of plants. They eat, they breathe oxygen. As long as you're alive, you're going to be breathing oxygen. All animals breathe oxygen. And we release CO2 with every breath we take. And we release water all the time. Right? So animals are called consumers because they have to consume their own food. Whereas plants and bacteria, like the ones that made the stromatolites, are producers. They make their own food through photosynthesis. These are the only 2 main forms of survival on our planet. And since there's no sunlight to drive photosynthesis forward, sunlight's required to drive photosynthesis forward on the bottom of the sea floor, we didn't think anything could be living here. And there couldn't be anything eating things down here because there's no producers for the consumers to eat. And thus, before we went to the bottom of the seafloor, we expected to be dead and lifeless. Maybe some creatures from higher up near the surface died and sank to the bottom, but that's about all we would see on the bottom. French submariners found these tiny little creatures, domain Archaea. They look like this. They're asexual creatures. They're prokaryotic. They have prokaryotic cells. These are not male or female. They replicate. They divide. Each 2 new organisms was identical to the one that produced it. They divide and divide and divide. So each individual is exactly the same. There's no variability. And when we study the three domains, domain Eubacteria, domain Archaea, and domain Eukarya, we find to our amazement that there is more genetic diversity amongst domain Archaea than all other forms of life. Think about what that means, ladies and gentlemen. If there's more forms of domain Archaea than all other forms of life on this planet, if there's more diversity for domain Archaea than all the other life forms on this planet, some scientists think that this must be the most domain Archaea, creatures like this who live under extreme conditions, either in extreme heat or they're also found in ice thousands of feet underneath Antarctica and the Arctic Sea, that these domain Archaea must be the most ancient form of life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so diverse. So the second hypothesis regarding the origin of life is it must have begun under extreme conditions that existed during the Archean, where you had more heat coming out of the earth. And so they may have existed around these hydrothermal vents, these black smokers, or in frozen ice, as it might have existed at the poles. Maybe that's where life began, in hot pools of water mostly, or in frozen ice, from these extremophiles, domain Archaea. We call them extremophiles because they live under extreme conditions, extreme heat or extreme cold. So the argument is because they're genetically diverse, they must be the most ancient form of life. This is how life began on planet Earth. Problem with this theory too. There's a problem with this theory too. If domain Archaea is the most ancient form of life, how come we haven't found them in the Archean rocks? We only find stromatolites, which are formed not from domain Archaea, but from domain Eubacteria. So this hypothesis, in my opinion, has a flaw in it. If it was true, then where are the fossils from the Archean? We don't have any. When the French submariners went down to the bottom of the sea floor, they also found these huge worms living in tubes. These get to be 8 to 10 feet long. And these worms feed on the tiny little microbes, the domain Archaea, in the hot water. So the worms exist around these black smokers, and they feed on domain Archaea. Interesting new ecosystem existing deep underneath the ocean. The other thing you will always want to bear in mind when you're looking at historical geology, as far as we know, the most ancient forms of life belong to what domain? A, Archaea, B, Eubacteria, or C, Eukarya? The answer should be, as far as we know right now, the most ancient forms of life, according to the rock record, belong to domain Eubacteria, EU bacteria. And these cyanobacteria produced these beautiful stromatolites, like you can see in these stromatolitic limestones, or as you can see in modern day stromatolites as they exist today in Sharks Bay, Australia. So the Archean is filled with tiny little fossils, all of them prokaryotes, all of them being prokaryotes, not eukaryotes, asexual creatures without gender. And they're all microscopic, they're all tiny. You can't see these with the naked eye. You need microscopes, sometimes powerful electron microscopes, to see them. Archean rocks contain valuable mineral resources, gold, platinum, zinc, copper, nickel, chrome, gemstones. Remember, the Earth used to be a lot hotter during the Archean, producing hot fluids, which we call hydrothermal fluids. Hydrothermal fluids concentrate precious metals, gold, silver, zinc, copper, chrome, etc. And they also, hot fluids or geothermal fluids produce gemstones, rubies, emeralds, sapphires. Gold is produced differently. I mean, not gold, but diamonds are produced different. They're produced down in the mantle, from carbon down in the mantle. But almost all precious metals and gemstones are concentrated in hot geothermal fluids, of which there existed many geothermal sources during the Archean when the Earth was a lot hotter. Bottom line is Archean rocks are valuable for their precious metals and gemstones. Geologists, when you get a 4-year degree in geology, you're going to have to make money for somebody. And one of the ways you're going to do it is by working for mining companies, looking for precious metals and gemstones. And Archean rocks are prime targets for those. Let's just get started a little bit on Chapter 9. Chapter 9, the Proterozoic Eon. Please don't forget that the Proterozoic Eon, and you should memorize this, the Proterozoic Eon goes from 2.5 billion years ago to 542 million years ago. So, believe it or not, this week we've covered the Hadean from 4.6 to 4 billion years ago. We covered the Archean, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the Proterozoic that began 2.5 billion years ago and ended 542 million years ago. We're going to talk both about Earth and life history. Let's just talk about it a little bit, and then we'll talk about it a lot more next week. Some characteristics of the Proterozoic Eon, and they misspelled that because that should be PR, Proterozoic Eon. Just as in the Archean, Proterozoic rocks do not have many fossils in them. Fossils are primarily found in Phanerozoic rocks, rocks that are younger than 542 million years old. Also, in the Proterozoic, you don't find those greenstone belts anymore. Greenstone belts are associated with komatiites, indicating what? What do you think it indicates? It indicates the Earth is cooling down. Very high temperatures are required to form komatiites, and so by Proterozoic time, the Earth is starting to cool down. You still get banded iron formations during the Proterozoic. And we get passive continental margins forming in the Proterozoic. What does that mean? Well, when you see beds of sandstone, shale, and limestone on top of each other, sandstone, shale, and limestone together, that indicates a coastline, a stable coastline. So these sandstone, shale, carbonate, I'll write it down here. So for it'd be easier on your notes. We find sandstone, shale, limestone complexes, which consist of sandstone overlain by shale, overlain by limestone, and that indicates stable continental margins, which means coastlines. That means continents were starting to become bigger during the Proterozoic. That's what it tells us. Here's the Proterozoic Eon here. Notice that we're going to be spending the whole rest of the semester on this Phanerozoic Eon from 542 million years ago to now. But let's first talk about the Proterozoic. And the first word you need to learn when you're talking about the Proterozoic is this word here, the word you've probably never heard of before, Laurentia, Laurentia. What does Laurentia mean? Laurentia is the name for ancient North America. We now know North America consists of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. This is Central America down here. Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, all that. But the three countries in North America are Canada, United States, and Mexico. And we call that North America today. However, North America was a lot smaller during the Proterozoic. It only consisted of these orange areas. All these areas in white, including Tennessee, did not exist yet. The continents started together during the Archean as little islands, maybe only 20 to 100 feet across. These islands collided, making bigger islands, to finally you had continental crest, which formed those granite gneiss complexes. And then these got glued together by greenstone belts, so that eventually you had a North America, which we called Laurentia back then, that was this over this area here. So we say that the ancient heart of North America is located around this body of water. What's this body of water called? Does anybody know? The Hudson Bay. So as you go north to the Hudson Bay, you get to the ancient heart of North America that existed during the Proterozoic in this area here. So North America was smaller. We call it, so for now on I'm just going to call it Laurentia until later on we'll call it North America. But this is North America. This is Laurentia from 1.8 to 2 billion years ago. Did Tennessee exist 1.8 to 2 billion years ago? No. Did Florida exist? No. Did New Jersey exist? No. Did Nova Scotia exist? No. Did Alaska exist? No. This was Laurentia 1.8 to 2 billion years ago. The continents are slowly growing. They're slowly growing. And so this was the coastline here of Laurentia 1.8 to 2 billion years ago. Okay, 1.8 to 2 billion years ago. Then by 1.65 to 1.76 billion years ago, new land was added to the southeastern margin of Laurentia with the addition of the Yavapai province and the Mazatlan province, which goes all the way from New Mexico through Michigan up to Canada. But you can see that Laurentia is growing towards the southeast during the Proterozoic Eon. 1.0 to 1.3 billion years ago, Laurentia grows further to the southeast with all of this additional land being added, including Tennessee in the Knoxville area, started to exist about 1 billion years ago. All of this land was added to the southeastern margin of Laurentia 1.0 to 1.3 billion years ago. Okay, I think that's enough for this week, and we'll talk about it more next week.